Ed Goldwyn produced many notable documentaries for the BBC, in particular in the Horizon series. But broadcasting hadn't been his original idea for a career.
No, when I left school, it was 3 years at Imperial College doing
Right.
physics, and then 4 years at the Royal Free Hospital Medical School doing medical physics. And when I got to the end of that, I was very disappointed in the physics. I'd been in a backwater for 4 years, and I realise now, looking back with what I've seen on my life from the BBC and the way it works, but I was a very diminished individual for having worked in a laboratory with an extremely, really critically shy supervisor. So when I got to the end of this kind of MSc thing, I didn't know what to do. And I went to the London University Graduate Advice Scheme, or whatever it was called.
Yeah.
And they said, well, tell me about, what are you good at? I said, well, I'm very good at making jewellery out of copper wire. And I took part in the Fastnet boat race, and I was, very accurate with the spinnaker, and we lost someone overboard in a huge storm, and we went back and found them. And we, my girlfriend and I, we bought a little boat down in Cornwall. We got to London.
Yes.
And he said, look, I think you're rather an oddball. I don't think you should go for a science career. I've got two funny things that have come in I didn't know what to do with. He said, one is a group of American architects who are building tower blocks in London with great bits on the top, which are for the very expensive executives, bathrooms and this and all the other, and kitchens. And they're looking for a young English person to come in and be part of their design team. I said, well, that sounds interesting. I kind of quite like that. And kitchens and food and money and so on. And then he said, and then we got this other funny job from the BBC. He said, but don't think many people of your calibre or something would want to go to the BBC. They said, but they're starting off a new series of educational programs for technical colleges for 14-year-old kids who are not very academic, probably could say not very bright, and they need to learn about simple physics in order to get their qualifications.
Yeah.
So I said, well, I'll give them a ring. So I rang the BBC first, as it happened, and they were very welcoming. And they said, oh, please come along. Yeah, there is a problem, they said, that job is 6 months old and we filled it 5 months ago. But we now realise we need 2 research assistants on this series, and we haven't advertised it yet, but come along. So I went along, and there was a sort of group of 2 or 3 of them, and they were just kind of nice. And they weren't interested in physics at all. They were not particularly interested in the jewellery, but they were very interested in this Atlantic race I'd been on.
Yes.
And the story of how this storm crept up on us just after we'd passed the Fastnet Rock. And it was bloody terrifying. And we lost someone overboard. I remember standing on the deck in nothing but my shirt, because I was down below when I heard this scream in the middle of the night saying, man overboard. And I sort of came up and was standing there holding onto various ropes with everything blowing in the wind.
Yeah.
And we got the sails down and we turned round and we were heading back in the dark. We didn't know where this poor fucker was.
Yeah.
I mean, he was obviously upwind, and somebody who'd been bright and thrown him a lifebelt. Immediately we'd heard the scream, and the lifebelt had a light on it. But whether he was near the light or not, I don't know. And as we come up, we couldn't see him most of the time because he needed to be on the top of a big wave and we did, otherwise it was hidden. So we gradually got back, and there he was, hanging onto it, stone cold, unable to move because he was so cold. Pulled him up underneath. Anyway, I think the BBC rather liked the way I told this story. And I think it's on that basis they asked me to come. I really do,
What kind of interview was it? A formal 5 Portland Place job?
No, it was the head
informal?
of department and the assistant head of department.
Really?
Kenneth Fordry and Don Grattan were the 2 people.
Ah, dear old Don Grattan, yes.
Yeah, he's lovely.
Yes,
he's
was.
lovely.
And so was Kenneth, I think, yes.
You knew Kenneth too, did you?
Oh, yes, but only for a very short time.
Yeah.
Oh,
Anyway,
right,
Donald, who I was the first person I went to work for when I went, he was doing a couple of pilot programs for this new series. And he said to me very early on, he said, Edward, your role is not to be like it has been in the past. You should be innocent. You shouldn't know anything, but you should be extremely intelligent. Your role is to go as a very intelligent person, wanting to know what this person has got to tell you. They will find that incredibly flattering. They will open up. If you start showing what you know, it will kind of shut them down. And that was the first bit of advice I got in the BBC. It was tremendous.
So you turned into effectively a journalist, in the sense you were going to find out. Because I think you have a great thing about not wanting to be didactic, but wanting to ask questions.
Yeah.
So you were a researcher on this thing, but did you go and get a chance to direct anything or write scripts or anything of this sort?
Well, that was part of it immediately.
Yeah.
I mean, after these 2 pilots were done, I was attached to Jeff Hall, who was a terrific producer, really terrific. And there was the other research assistant who'd come earlier called Morton, and we had a series of, I think, 20 to make. And he'd say, I'll do one, Morton does one, you do one, I'll do one. But, you have to do it through me, so I approve of everything. But in the end, you go out with the film crew. In the end, you direct it in the studio. You go and talk to Wormses about the graphics, whatever it is, And that was just tremendous, because I had to find a way of telling these kids what voltage was. And I thought, well, I never really understood that, and so on. So I went back to these people I had really revered at Imperial College and said, look, I have to explain voltage to 14-year-olds and give me some insights into it. And I remember he said, well, it's the integral of E over ds. I said, but that doesn't mean anything to me. Maybe it doesn't to them. And I discovered that he didn't really know how to explain it to somebody who was not in the swim. No, somebody who was using the language almost like a religious person uses the language and says, it's ultimate forgiveness and so on. No, it doesn't mean anything to me. I don't know what it means. The same with all the stuff in physics. And I found it's rare that you find people who can explain things. And if you say to somebody, look, I don't understand that. And if you have a really, really good scientist, he will say, well, do you know anything about motor cars? And he'll make analogies to do with that. Or it's like meteorology. And he zeroes down, and you feel this person drilling into your head to actually click onto something that he can then build on. And that's the way I decided after that was my way to choose people to have in my programs.
Yes.
Everybody I gave an audition to was in a situation like this when I was trying to say, I need to understand this. And so I did need to understand. You've just done all this work on proteins and this, and it's the way it folds that makes the germs survive or disappear. I say, I don't quite get it. And if they go into very arcane chemistry, I say, look, thank you very much, Prof. That's been really useful. Thank you. If I get into, I'll be in touch later, and get out the door quite quickly. And it's people who can change,
Yeah.
And
the higher they were, probably the easier they found it to think like that.
You would usually find that the person who'd won a Nobel Prize was actually quite good at this. But also quite a young PhD student who's got that kind of mind can be like it.
Now, this was fairly early on in the existence of the BBC educational departments in television. They'd been there in radio. I mean, I remember Music and Movement and all that sort of thing when I was at school. Where was it based? Was it at Fillier's house by this time, or where was it?
No, we were in the television centre.
Oh, were you?
Up on the 7th floor.
Really? Well, virtually new.
Yes, it was still being built at that end.
And how did you take to studio direction?
Loved it. On this first day, when I told you I went in to see Fordry and Grattan, I didn't know whether I liked this or not or something. And they said, well, that's very good. You may be here for the day. We'd like you to go down and watch a programme we've got being made, in Studio 5. And I thought, it'd be very interesting. Yes, thank you very much, And I went down and sat in the back of the gallery. And I was mesmerised by all this. I could see the sound man. I could see the vision mixing. I watched what was going on the floor. The director said, stop, I want you to do it in this way and this way and that way. And I thought, could that be me? it sounds impossible, but
Yeah.
what a terrific environment. What a terrific hands-on experience. Wonderful. And the end product is there.
Yes.
It's recorded, it's there, and you've done it.
Mm.
It is so different from what I was used to. I never got in touch with the architectural firm.
So, pure enthusiasm. I mean, I found studio directing terrifying, but I was quite good at it. I had James McCloy. Do you remember James?
Oh, I know
McCloy?
James
Yes.
extremely well.
He was
yeah.
wonderful, but he was a tartar.
He was very difficult, actually.
Very difficult, yes.
He would keep all his points he wanted to make until the lineup. Terrible.
Oh gosh, and then defeat you and makes you feel as if you
Yeah.
were that high. Yes,
Yes.
but he was a great guy though.
I'll tell you this story. I had one program when I was in further education later. It was a pet project of James, which was about the discoveries that followed on from DNA and proteins and the way it is all decoded and the way proteins work and control biology and so on. And I had 10 programs called What is Life? And James it was his idea in the beginning, and he persuaded me to do it, which I was really delighted to do. And at the end of one film, which was called What is Life? It was about control of the chemical processes, and it began showing A, and then B, and then there was Jacques Monod, who was a Nobel Prize winner, who I'd gone to see, the first really serious person I'd got. At the lineup, he said, Ed, you've got it all wrong. It's all wrong, he said. You begin by giving the answer away. In the middle should be the beginning, the end should be the middle, and that should be the end. And you come at the end with Jacques Monod, the guy who got the Nobel Prize for understanding this, and the audience can go, and that was James all the time. What is the audience feeling, and so on. So I, did that and line up. He said, "You don't have to do it. I know this. I know." So I said, "Oh fuck!" I said, "So in the lineup, I said, camera one, your first shot is etc. All that stuff and shit."
Yeah.
And when I got home, I felt really destroyed. Chum said, "Was it a good day?" I said, "It was awful. I feel so miserable, so destroyed. I feel so weak." Because James, and I told her this story,
Really?
and she said, "Do you think James was right?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Well, not to have done it would have been the weak thing to do."
Yes. How interesting. Yes, I had James because I produced Medicine Today,
Oh, I remember that.
and that was fairly hairy. Stop the recording! Stop the recording! No, you can't do this. Anyway, so you're in education. You're a scientist by training, but you have a very journalist's view, in a sense, of the material.
I think of myself as a journalist.
Yeah. Now, I think you said in one of your things on the history of Horizon that the BBC, when you were in education, was very compartmentalised, and it was rather difficult to jump. And you went to the Open University, I think, for a while, didn't you?
It was impossible.
Well, tell
For
me,
me,
tell me
I
about
don't know other people.
Tell me about the BBC's constraints on you then.
Well, it was Aubrey Singer. That was the constraint.
Really?
I started in schools, and I think I did. I don't know if you saw the programs about computing that I did. I think they were really special.
Yeah.
And it was the first people to talk about compilers. We made the first ever computer animation. I'm talking about 1963, something like that. And it was great. And then I went to, advertisements came up for science and features, and I'd go along. And Aubrey would always say, with Phil Daly sitting by the side of him, "Look, you're from schools. You're not the sort of people we want. You have a captive audience. I'm not saying that what you do isn't good. I'm just saying it's not what we do. We have to get hold of people. We want people who've been fighter pilots, not somebody who's been wearing a white coat." And so it went on, and
Really?
it went on. And then I went to further education, and then I left that actually for a year to go to London Weekend. And then when London Weekend had the big disappointment with what they were doing, and most of the BBC staff walked out, I walked out too and came back to the Open University.
Right.
And that was absolutely terrific. And then I went to Community Programme Unit, and we did some good, really, really good stuff. And Rowan Ayres was in charge, and I was second. And Rowan Ayres he left to go to Australia. And they wanted to put name will come to me, it begins with B, but it doesn't matter who it was, in charge as head of department because they wanted to promote him up. A very tall man, very tall,
Right.
strong. But I was the obvious candidate because I'd been the one who had worked with Rowan to set it up in the first place. I had a background in making films with people who were, applying to the BBC. I went and did a lot of research in the Canada Film Board about the way they'd done it. And Aubrey was on the board. And he said to me, we think you need to leave the community programme. There isn't room for two biggish guys. So we're making space for so-and-so, He said, what would you like to do? And I said, I want to go to Science and Features. And he said, oh my God. He said, well, we'll arrange an attachment. And if you do well with that, then you'll move. And that's how I got into Science and Features.
The good old BBC attachment system, which in a way you were almost implying didn't really exist between the departments in the years
Yes.
before that. These assumptions about education, that it was a ghetto, it was somehow not proper television. Education had ring-fenced budgets. Nobody else did, I don't think, which was very important. And that, of course, produced some resentment, I believe. It had the Continuing Education Advisory Council, there was the Schools Broadcasting Council, not telling people what to do exactly, but sort of controlling the curriculum.
It was a ghetto, but it didn't feel like one, because I never felt at all limited in any way about what I was trying to do for the audience and so on.
Yeah.
If there was criticism from Controller 1 or later Controller 2 or anything like that, there was this huge hierarchy of people who told them, but that is what we want the BBC to do. And they didn't really have the authority. They might say it's not good storytelling, it's not this, but they could never say it wasn't the sort of stuff was there. And you only became aware of it, perhaps, when you left.
Yes.
And when you wanted the best cameraman were great to work with. The medium cameramen said, oh, it's only schools, what do you want? A torch and a brownie camera or something.
I know exactly what you mean, yes.
Yes.
Correct, yes. Tell me about the culture, though, between you went to London Weekend and then you came back. What did you hope to find in independent television that you weren't getting at the BBC?
Oh, well, more money and more more opportunity to do documentary.
Mm.
And that really didn't happen. It was interesting,
Yes.
and I'm sort of pleased I did it. Well, James came to see me and said, Ed, I think you're leaving, but why didn't you come back? I'm moving to the Open University. He said, we don't have anybody who's any good at maths. You've done a whole lot of maths programming for schools and further education. It'd be a great strength if you came. Well, I liked James, and I liked the idea, and I thought the Open University was an absolutely first-class thing that should happen in Britain, and great that the BBC were doing it.
Yeah.
So I was there for the first 4 years.
Okay, so you turn up on attachment to Science Features. Tell me about that, and being in Kensington House, presumably, which was a bit of a hotbed.
Hotbed of what?
Well, I think it was probably full of very talented, rather self-opinionated people running really rather high-profile programmes.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think it was quite difficult, really quite difficult.
Yeah,
We're talking about 1-2 years in schools, 2 years in FE,
yeah,
a year out at London Weekend, and then 4 years at Open University,
4 years.
of which I was very proud. We'd done a lot. We had a lot of new people that we had to train and so on and so forth. And here was the chance, It had been waiting maybe 7 years. A lot hung on it. And Peter said to me, Peter Goodchild, what is it you like to do when you're attachment? I said, I've been looking at this very carefully. There's this incredible plague of starfish destroying the coral reefs.
Mm-hmm.
He's a fairly youngish man. He has quite severe dandruff. And when he gets anxious, the dandruff comes down on his shoulders like like snow.
Yes.
So he said, look, I'm not really sure I want, that's not really something that's really in your expertise. I mean, filming underwater stuff in the so-and-so and dealing with these biologists over in Hawaii, it doesn't seem to play to your strength and so on, he said. But come on, have you got anything else that you're interested in? Anything else? And I said, well, yes, I've just read a book called How Children Fail.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you ever read it, a tiny little book, that thick, that size,
Yeah.
so on, written by a teacher who talks about how the best teachers in the world often don't reach their children. They're busy looking at the blackboard and they don't see the puzzlement behind them. He organised in a primary school that he worked, that the teachers would come to the back of their other people's classes and watch what happened. And they all pointed out to each other that a lot of what they did was, in a sense, private to the teacher, and the children were not getting it because they didn't have this, and the student had it, and so on. And he wrote a fabulous book about it, and that's where this stuff about if-then statements at home came from. So I said, I'd like to do that. And he said, well, that sounds right on the ball. He said, it's for people, it's about their intimate experience with their children, and the research is great because there was research happening with 2-month-old babies, 2-minute-old babies, where they were doing experiments on them and showing that they could make logical deductions of a very simple kind and so on. So he said, yeah, let's go with that. So I spent my time on the phone and I found everything that was going on everywhere, and I wrote a really good report about what we were going to do.
Yes.
And Peter said, this is great, go ahead with it. And I went off and I got really scared. I thought, I can't do this. I don't know what's happening. And I got, this is before the first day's filming, so I went to my wife, who's a doctor, and said, Chum, I want you to break my leg. And she said, why? And I said, I can't do this. If my leg is broken, I can be invalided out and go back to the Open University and be very happy. But I just can't do this. And she said, I'm not going to break your leg, she said. Peter's taken on a risk, because he had, and I won't go into that yet, against Phil Daly and taking me as an attaché. Phil Daly didn't want it. You can't ignore Peter's contribution. You've got to go and talk to him about this. So I went in to see Peter, the following Monday. That was Friday before it happened. And I said, Peter, and he looked, the bloody dandruff was coming down like anything. And he said, what's up? I said, look, I don't think I can do this. I'm not sure. I'm not convinced by it. And he said, all right. He said, look, let's take a bit of time. And he got my paper out. He said, this is sequence 1, he said. It shows babies being shown flashing lights in Edinburgh University, and according to the flashing lights, they make decisions about how they're going to switch it on and off. He said, is that true, or have you made it up? I said, it's true. Okay, he said. Have you got permission to do it? And I said, yes. He said, do you know how to do it? I said, well, probably. When I take photos of the baby, because I was really, really down. Yeah. And he said, he said, that sounds to me like it's very interesting, and I would like to see it. Let's look at the next sequence. The next sequence is, you're with these mothers and babies using an Etch-a-Sketch. And the point is that unless the mother gives clear instructions, the kid can't do it. So, and it takes place in Princeton in the US, and it's a Dr. Shipman. He said, is that true? And I said, yes, she does this, and so on. He said, will she do it? Oh, yes, I've spoken to her. She's quite enthusiastic to take part of this. Can she get the mothers? Yes, she told me she's got 3 mothers lined up, one of whom which will fail badly in this. Okay. Well, he said, I think I want to see that. And he got through to the end, and he said, Edward, he said, you shouldn't worry, he said. Of course it's high tension, but go and do it. And he said, I'm sure it'll be great.
How very encouraging. That's a terrific attitude, yeah.
I kind of owe an awful lot to Peter.
Because it wasn't just saying, oh, you'll be all right.
No.
It was actually going through the script and looking at the ideas and being supportive. Yeah, no, that's terrific.
And when we got to the end of the fine cut on the, piece of film this big, and it was a Sunday night, and I was just shaking with. This had been a terrible ride, but I enjoyed it my first time in America. There were wonderful things, but it was also. And he leaned across and he said, Ed, he said, well done. He said, you've done it. He said, I'm pleased to have this. The only thing wrong with it, he said, is the end is wrong. And he said, it's not the pictures, it's you just end weekly. You say, that this is, we now know this and this and this, and we should do something about it. He said, I don't want Horizons to end like that. He said, have you read the Plowden report, and do you think she's right? Mm-hmm. I said, who am I to criticize the fucking Plowden report? It's not me, no. Well, he said, what about the government policy on primary schools? Do you agree with that? I said, well, people have talked to me about it, but I'm not too sure. I think it's going in the wrong direction. He said to me this. He said, look, Ed, he said, you've spoken to every bloody expert in the world, as far as I can see. And for the next 3 weeks, you are the world's walking expert because of that. He said, for fuck's sake, say something. Yeah. And write it now, and I'll be in on Monday. Yeah. And I sat there I didn't know what to say. Who am I to say this? And in the end, I wrote something that was sort of all right and was a bit strong. It said, we now know why a child will fail, and we can do something about it. We know now why a 13-year-old does this, and we can do something about it. And what is to blame is the fact that mothers are so poor, they don't have space, they don't know enough. We now know what to do. Now we must act. And I like the act because it was a terrific word, A-C-T, strong T, and it ended, and then it rolled up the curtains. And Peter said, yeah, well done. Not bad. And from that, I learnt the importance of actually saying something, not sitting on a fence.
In those days, all you had was the telephone. You could write to people. You can go and visit them. There was no internet. It was very difficult. You could read people's books. How long did you have to take to prepare a program in those days?
Well, I mean, there are many programs we're talking about. But if I talk about Horizon, that was... once you'd agreed a program with Peter or whoever it was, you had about 2 weeks to decide what you were going to do with it. And then you had about 2 weeks to film it. And then you had about 5 weeks to edit it. So you're absolutely on the ball when you say the phone was the most important thing. And once we got the go-ahead on something, I was on the phone from 9 o'clock at night until 9 in the morning, using the lines to America, phoning Germany, phoning Japan, phoning everybody in England, and trying to get some visits in just to make it more real. Go and see people in London at University College or Oxford or something, because you get a lot more out of being in a person's room than you do out of on the phone.
But also you were looking for visual material, so you had to...
True, but more than that, I was actually looking for steps, things that seemed to me important. Like
to tell the story.
If you're telling a story about, development of children's minds or something, these guys in the States at Wisconsin who've been training chimpanzees to use tools or to things on, they're kind of quite important. That's going to be important. So you ring them up, you ring them up at about 10 o'clock English night time. My wife never saw me. Even at home, I was on the bloody telephone. Yeah. And the nice thing about the Americans was they were so welcoming, amazingly so. They would say, oh, I said, you're a BBC? And I say, yeah, oh, yeah. Well, that's good. He said, we did an interesting experiment this afternoon. He said, if you'd been here, you would have found it very interesting to film. We took a monkey, so on. And they said, your stuff often appears on the American PBS. So they know that if they cooperate with this, they might get themselves on American television.
I see.
I mean, they have a great respect for British science.
Yes, of course.
And the next thing they usually say, well, look, if you could get here relatively soon, we could set it up again if that would be for you. Now, that was marvelous. If you ever stuck for something, ring America, because you can get on the phone to Boston quite early on in the evening, And by about, midnight, 2 o'clock, you can be talking to Berkeley and San Francisco and UCLA and so on.
Yeah.
So trawling across the whole of America, you can always find enough to fill your program in.
But in order to get to those people, you had to read the literature or read,
Yes.
Scientific American or something like that. Did the ideas tend to come from there initially, or
no? The idea tends to come from something you've thought from reading magazines, reading papers, and going and talking to people. That enough is known now, say, about the way a child's mind develops between 0 and 5, that you could make some sense of preparing a kid so it will do well in maths or science when it gets to school. A lot of that is to do with how the parents treat it. Do they say, do this, that, or if you don't do this, I will do that, and then. So if they're using if-then statements to the kids, kids kind of, and so on, stuff like that.
Yeah.
So you get a feeling of the geography of where you want film sequences of research which just conveys something very straightforward and so on.
In the case of that, of course, you could proselytize, couldn't you? You could actually preach, in a sense, by saying your child will develop, more rapidly in this kind of way if you use this kind of language, this kind of structure. But did you feel you were in that business of telling people, in a sense, what to do?
In a sense, I suppose, yes. If that kind of thing did look very important from the research, I think it's important to tell people. I think the answer is yes. I did feel that.
Yeah. Right. Now I'm going to bring you to the program which affected me more than any other, because it led on to the Computer Literacy Project, which is now the Chips Are Down. And that program, if you remember, also ended with, what's the attitude of the government? A resounding silence, I think, was the...
the silence is terrifying.
The silence is terrifying.
Was the last word.
That's right, yes. Now, that was incredibly influential, that program. And although I didn't come and talk to you about it because I was, I was being sort of asked to look at this, quotes, revolution, the microelectronics revolution, and was going and talking to people like think tank people and so on. I should have come to talk to you, really, because you'd made this program. The rumour is that it was shown to the cabinet.
Yeah, it was.
Now tell me about it. And tell me about how you approached that subject, because here's yet another subject, quite complicated, all sorts of ramifications, social, political, scientific, economic, affecting people's jobs, the job killer, as the Germans called it. Computers weren't really around in the high street at those times, but things were happening. So how did you approach that? And how did the politicians get involved?
There's quite a lot to say. I said quite some of it to Simon when we were doing the interviews on the 50 years of Horizon. I may, be repeating some of the stuff that he's got. I hope that doesn't matter.
No, it doesn't at all.
Well, I had done, I thought, some really important programs on computers for sixth forms. I knew about them and so forth, and that was great. And then after doing ones about enzymes, and I'm now talking about moving to Horizon, and after about kind of 3 years, which is like about 9 horizons, I was feeling fairly full of myself. I still was scared, and I still found it very difficult to know what to put into any program, and I still was like a maniac phoning everybody on the planet. But Simon called me in and said, Ed, I've got a program here that I think it should be you. He said, look, and he showed me, I've got this little chip and it's the size of a computer. I'd like you to follow a program about it because I've been told by the guys at NPL this is really important. And I said, Simon, I don't really think that's for me. And he said, why not? And I said, well, I don't think, the story is, here's a chip on your finger. It's the size of a postage stamp. What is the other 59 fucking minutes about? I said, it could be about the techniques of making things very small and so on, but that's not where I'm driving at the moment. I just don't see what the story is. And he said, all right. He said, I'll find someone else. What do you want to do? And I said, well, I'd like to make one about the future, about, the next 25 years. The Queen was having a 25th Jubilee.
Yeah.
Make a program for the 50th Jubilee. Oh, he said, all right, So he was trying to sell that one as well. And after a week, I went back to Simon and said, have you still got that program? He said, yes. I said, I want to do it.
Yeah.
And he said, what's changed? Why do you want to do it? Because I've learnt something really important about preparing this program for the future. It doesn't matter a sod that they are this size. It matters they're only $5 each. That is going to change the world. So he said, okay. So I then kind of went on with two of them together, as it were. And the thing that struck me was I went to I was told that various civil servants who advised the government about science were trying to interest Kaufman in the fact that this was coming. So I went to see them. I love going to these buildings down around Parliament Square.
This was the Callaghan government.
Yes, that's right. And they said, Ed, yes, you're onto something good. It's also, we write papers for, but they Kaufman doesn't take any notice and so on and so on. So they said, any help we can give you, be great, but we're not having any effect. So I said, well, what help can you give me? And it actually wasn't terribly much use, the sort of thing they give me. So I left them and so on and went on with it and made this program. And when it was very lucky it wasn't a co-production. Really lucky. Because if it was a co-production, there would have been half American money in it or something significant. And it couldn't have been, what does this mean for England? It could mean, what does this mean for the world? What will this do? It would have been much more technical and about computing than about social issues and so on. So that was one very good thing. And then, as it went on, it became more and more apparent that nobody was really listening to what was going on. Nobody at all. And I had all these incredible robots and these incredible people who were using it to do a kind of AI, automatically diagnose complicated diseases and so on and so forth. And it all added up to a very strong picture. And I phoned Kaufman and spoke to his PR lady and said, look, I've got this program. It's almost done. It shows A, B, C, and D. I know that your people have been trying to warn you. I'd like to have him on the end talking about the significance of this. And I want to show him the program because I don't want anything like there will be light at the end of the tunnel and we will do something. Yes. And she said, no, he hasn't got time to look at your cut. He will talk about the importance of this. But I said, look, if he doesn't see my program beforehand, I'm not interested. Because the last thing I want is the embarrassment of having filmed a minister and leaving his stuff on the cutting room floor. Yeah. I really hate that idea, loathe it. So I'd rather avoid it. And she said, well, no, it's absolutely final. He can't see it. And therefore, it's up to you to decide. So I was going across Hammersmith Bridge. And I was on my bicycle. And I was thinking, I am so worried. I am terribly, terribly worried. And I looked at the woman pushing a pram and I thought, well, she's not worried. She's not. And then I saw a number 9 bus coming the other way, double-deckers then. And the bus driver gave me a wave. And I thought, he's not worried. And then I thought, James McCloy. I thought, that's it. Nobody's worried. That is it. I don't have to tell people this is important. I just have to say this is significant and nobody is worried. And suddenly I knew the end, and that's how it happened. So, luckily, one of the shots that I hadn't quite used very much was of an automatic retrieval pallet thing going through a huge warehouse, going on and on and on and on and on and on. And I wrote this end bit in the cutting room and said to Ted, who was the editor, fabulous, fabulous, fabulous helper, I said, Ted, look, here's the end. We know this, we know the other, and so on, so. But the future is going to be, the questions it raises are money, politics, this, that, and the other. But nobody is talking about it in government. The silence is terrifying. He said, great, that'll do. That'll be great at the end. He said, and even Peter will like that. So I said, what have we got to go over it? I said, I don't know. We've got fuck all. We've got this shot of the warehouse. So we put it up, and I read this piece as it ran through the, what it was, Steenbeck. Steenbeck. And the last sentence, the film ran out, and it was looking at the wall at the end. And I said over that, the silence is terrifying. And we looked at each other, and we said, that's absolutely right.
Yes.
The screen should go black, and should say it over black, not distract.
Yes. Yes.
So that's how the end happened. The reason for going on with black after that was that I had taken a decision about 5 or 6 horizons before that, not to make the closing titles interesting, because here I worked for 8 minutes to get people to talk to each other, for the father to turn to the son or the mother and say, did you really believe that? Wasn't that bollocks? Wasn't that interesting? Yeah. But before that happens, that key bit happens, presentation comes up and says, that was all very interesting, but what we've got now is Bertie zooms with his fabulous jokes, and everybody zooms back and sits back and watches. So as order to sabotage that, I stopped making end credits, which were good. It goes to black, the roller comes up, it says Ed Goldwyn, it goes up slowly, and very soft, unimportant music until it says Peter Goodchild, and then it fades out. And I say to myself, if you haven't started talking now, you poor fuckers, you've wasted it.
Of course, it's even worse now because the credits get squashed out or moved into a tiny window.
Then what happened is Callaghan's office rang up to the BBC and said, Prime Minister's just seen this. Can he have the programme shown in the House of Commons tomorrow? I don't think it was the Cabinet Room. I think it was the House of Commons, but I'm not. And I was told, and this was quite marvellous, so it was taken and it was done. Yes. And Callaghan gave it to ICI, who had a big office block just down the road from, and said they should look at it, and they did. And it was sent with the British ambassador or man who goes to the OECD, who took it with him and played it there, which was amazing. And I know that it was played in Norway and led to various things there. And when I went to Australia to do something about 4 years later, he said to me, this was, his name will come to me, but he's a curious guy who was a television showman, originally a scientist, who became Minister of Technology. And he said to me, you're the guy who did chips, aren't you? I said, yes. He said, I saw that program so many times. He said, I went with it and it was shown all over the country and we had to take questions about it, and it became important in the way the Australians made their decisions about technology. It was why we became a country determined to get into high science, which we began with veterinary medicine, so on. So that's what I know about it.
Well, of course, it affected us enormously because, but I think Mrs. Thatcher had come into power because when we started planning our thing, Kenneth Baker got interested, and he was looking for quick wins for her. He's actually interviewed by I think Peter Hennessy, saying Margaret wanted some quick wins, so we thought computers in schools. And the BBC machine, of course, which was part of our offering. Very controversial, really, looking back. But we were pushing it an open door because she really did get it, I think. It's interesting that it was Callaghan's government who began to get it as a result of now the chips are down. But we certainly got it because of now the chips are down, and it led to the whole thing that we did. So it was a very influential thing. So thank you, Ed, for making that programme.
There's a coda to it, really, is that the government chief scientist, who was a big plump guy who was ex-senior scientist from ICI, he called me and said, look, we weren't able to attract the right attention, and yet you come on bloody television and you change everything. I would like you to spend a weekend with all my senior science leaders of the laboratories like the National Marine Laboratory and etc., and teach them how to communicate. And so I said, fine. And it was a rather nice weekend down at a civil service place down near Guildford, and they had 2 film crews, and they had their own film crews and so on. And, we got people to make their own films and so on, within the thing to talk about how they could use. And yet in the end they said, look, we can't talk to ministers in the way that you can. We learnt something from this, but I'm not sure we can do what you do.
Yes. Well, good, because you're a professional television producer, and they're not.
Yeah.
Now, if you took a subject, I want to go on further with your career, but I mean, if you were to take a subject like global warming now, you say you're always interested in asking questions, and the question wouldn't be necessarily what is the science behind global warming. It would be what is the sociology behind it, what is the politics behind it, what are the economics behind getting the world to take it seriously. What would be your approach, do you think?
We have to go back a step, really. Is that I don't know. I don't know the approach yet, because I don't know what's in it. I know there have been pretty wonderful programs made about global warming, and they have covered, a lot of ground. I don't know what the ground is actually now. And I used to feel and do it. I mean, I lived by this. We could sit in the top pimple of Kensington House, a lot of clever people, maybe Peter and the others, and we could talk about what was the essence of this program, what we need. Will we begin with a red-hot sun boiling out a fish, which will we do this, we'll do that, so on. It's a sort of necessary preparing yourself, but it is also a wank, because you're being very kind of upper middle class and superior in thinking you know what the proles need to know. You know what the truth is. And I liked taking part in that game. I thought it was great. But once I'd written the thing that came out of that, then out of the telephone calls, it wasn't for me great unless a lot had got crossed out and replaced and so on. And then when I got on a train to go somewhere, say to talk to somebody at Cambridge or to do something, I tried to forget all the clever knicker stuff we'd said to each other in Kensington House and ask them what they thought. And the other thing I always asked, which was really important for me, I asked, who else do you listen to? Who else do you think is the people who you think are really switched on? I'd say, can I have their phone number?
Yes.
And
what about Mr. Lawson, you would say, for example?
Well, it might, if they said something that was interesting about it. But, I mean, he is part of the knockabout stuff, isn't he?
Yes, yes.
I don't think he really knows anything. But if one was talking, and it may well go that way in a film I was making, to talk about the ding-dong and how important it is, then he would be very relevant. So you see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Until I start digging and find what particularly interests me that I think will interest the public, I can't sort of answer that.
Yeah.
But we know, because it's an area which has been tilled over. I can't tell you whether I think trying to understand the ding-dong, which might have all sorts of ramifications with Trump and fact and so on, that might be the most important program to make now, and not about the science.
Because it's certainly, we live in a polarized world in terms of politics at the moment, and America is the most beautiful example of that. We're going that way ourselves, and you're absolutely right. And of course here you've got this issue of balance, good old BBC balance. What is balance when it comes to this issue? There's no doubt that I suspect that if you looked at the Republicans, you would find that they were more sceptical about global warming than the Democrats. And
I just want to say that you're almost getting me heaped up on this, because the way that Democrats are treating the Trump stuff, with trying to hold kind of semi-television friendly, getting people to talk about what's wrong with Trump, I think it's probably the best antidote that I may not be effective that I've heard going at the moment. So maybe that with Lawson, with something about what's happening,
Yes.
and treating the global warming as being the ping pong ball, which is so dangerous, but not being treated with the
Yes.
seriousness that
Yes.
civilization
Because people
deserves.
don't really feel it yet.
Yes.
They don't really feel it. You need to
So that's not about
we need
science.
to be flooded by the Thames coming over and everything else before
That's
we start
right.
saying, "Oh golly, it affects us too." Let's go back to Kensington House. What was the culture like there? You implied that people were talking about ideas an awful lot.
Well, very frequently, people would come in. People like Alec or Fontaine or Viv King or something, because they've got so far, their ear is flat, they've had enough.
Yeah.
And they say, Ed, I don't know where I'm getting to. And saying, what do you think? What do you think? One of the most famous programs was from Chris Sykes about Feynman. Do you know that one where
no.
he begins in a chair and he says, a friend of mine thinks we scientists are something like, we talk about a flower, and he says he thinks in it that I can't see. I don't know if it goes on. He talks about what science contributes. And Chris came into my office. He said, look, I spent 3 weeks with Feynman. I've been fascinated. He's charming and so on. He said, but there's nothing to film but him. I don't know if I can go ahead with it. It seems to me I'm getting trapped. I'm going down this path, and I think the end is going to be terrible. So, he came in about 3 times to talk about it.
Yes.
And that was not uncommon,
Yes.
Chris Fontaine said he wanted to make a film about horses. And I was kind of unreceptive, said, I'm not sure it's really a Horizon thing, but it was his thing. But he needed somewhere to go and talk. And we did that somewhat to each other.
But in an encouraging way.
In a helpful way.
In a helpful way.
It might have been helpful to say, I don't see that there's...
Yes, not necessarily encouraging.
No,
yes,
I'd say, well,
the opposite, yes.
do you mind making a program that's only a really good talking head? I'd
Yes,
say...
yes.
The arts programs do it all the time. There was a fantastic program about Picasso, whatever, you can make people, give them confidence by asking the right kind of questions.
Going back to the very origins of Horizon, the original idea was it was going to be like Monitor, wasn't it, with a presenter and a firm editorial to camera style, and that fell away, didn't it?
But the first one was not like that.
You've never had a presenter.
Well, it became that
Oh,
when
it did?
the first editor, I think, was Gordon Rattray Taylor. I'm not sure, but the first person who made one about Buckminster Fuller, and he was an architectural student, the guy who had made it.
Yes.
Quite long in the tooth, beautiful. He looked like Tortelier. And, he was patrician.
Yes.
And he wanted a patrician thing. And he took Buckminster Fuller to lecture to the guys at the University College School of Architecture down near Trafalgar Square.
Yeah.
And 25 minutes of this program is that lecture. I mean, you'd need a lot of courage to do that now and so on. But that was all right. It was the first Horizon. And I think it was very fluffy and so on. And it was later, when somebody else brought in, they decided to have Chris Chataway or somebody became the first talker. And then that disappeared later because it was rather limiting.
Did that mean it was originally a film stroke studio?
No, it was
combination?
film.
It was all
always
film.
conceived as all film.
Right, okay. But you lost the idea of the InVision presenter, and went for Peter Vaughan.
Paul Vaughan,
yes.
Yeah.
Paul Vaughan, who's got just the right voice for this sort of thing.
Loved him.
Yes. So how did your career go on then after this particular period, the late 70s, early 80s? Did you go on making Horizons for many years? It's a great thing.
I think I
to be
made
doing.
one more after that, because at home, on my 50th birthday, around the birthday table, the kids and my wife said to me, well, Ed, you're 50 now. You've always said that you don't want your life to be only university and the BBC. There must be some other way of being, and it has very dominated your life. Yes. And you've said you'll leave at 50. Are you going to? Now's the time to make a decision. Really? And I thought, you must be joking and so on. But as the week went by, I thought, well, it is now or never. No one's going to employ a 55-year-old ex-BBC person, and so on. And I left with one horizon to make, which was the one about the diseases caused by a poison, which mimic the neurological diseases like Parkinson's and so on. It was called The Poison That Waits. It was very good. And there was actually another reason why it was ripe for me to leave the BBC there, I think. But anyway, I left, and from there I started making films for the BBC and for London Weekend.
As a freelance, yeah.
As a freelance.
Yes.
We make a company called Goldwyn Associates,
Right.
which I think was a mistake, actually, because I was much better as being a freelance than being a company. I'm no good at the politics, absolutely none.
Bureaucracy, yeah.
So we made programs
Yes.
about AIDS for Channel 4 and about divorce for the BBC and about this Horizon for the BBC and,
So you did
programs
make
about
that
disease.
Horizon programme,
Yes.
the one that you'd been planning.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, what would, culturally, Channel 4 in danger now of being privatised, BBC in danger now of being throttled
Well, it was
cut
different.
down.
It was very different. You weren't part of it. When you went in to talk to somebody, the person you went to talk to came down and talked you into the canteen. So you didn't go past the security.
Yes.
I really found that really odd. When you were showing them a rough cut, they came to the cutting room and so on. And when we finally delivered this series of four Channel 4 about AIDS, which I think are very good, I still think they were great.
Yes, sir.
I conceived them as one being like a horizon, one being like a pair of eyes, one being, a different kind of documentary, another one. I took the films in to their dispatch at the back. They took them in, and I got whatever it was, like £100,000 or something, as the final fee and recompense and so on.
Yes.
Of which something like 20,000 was profit for our trouble and something like that.
Yes.
And I thought I could go and buy cabbages with this and become a cabbage merchant. There's no momentum to actually carry on making stuff for Channel 4. To make another one for Channel 4, I have to put in a proposal and I have to go through all that difficult crap.
Yes.
Why do you want to make this? It's
Pitching,
not like
yes.
the BBC
Yes,
where
yes.
you're arguing.
Yes.
And nobody wants to know from me, actually, because this was where the culture was very different. I hadn't realized it till 10 seconds ago when you asked me about this. In the Channel 4, they wanted a well-developed proposal, that you knew what you were going to do. And my thing of saying, I want to find out what there is and react to the reality. Well, they said, very well, Goldwyn, we'll go to somebody else.
Yes. Now that is interesting, because the old BBC was perfect for that style
Yes.
of program making. And but when you were making programs for the BBC, did you feel, as it were, you were going back home and you could go in and talk to people in the way that you did before, or was it just like working with Channel 4?
Well, it was very close to having left the BBC, and I don't remember it as being different.
No.
There is something important that has happened, though. When my children were growing up, we almost got divorced, because there was one Saturday morning, I said to my wife, look, I'm sorry, this weekend I've got to go in and write this commentary for this and so and so and so. And I came back in a minute later and look, someone's stolen the car. And she said, no, I've hidden it. And I said, but I need it, tell me, where is it? And she said, no, you can go in if you want to, but you're going to have to walk in or take a bath. I said, what's all this about? And she said, you promised that we would go to the zoo, I forgot, today with the children. And I said, in fact, that promise was about 3 months ago. And we cancelled it and changed it and cancelled it and changed it. So I've decided I'm not going to put up with it anymore. You can be with the BBC if you can't, but I think we're not really living as a family at all. And I said, you bloody bitch, you this, the other, you that and the other, and so on, so on, so on. And I went in and I couldn't write a bloody word, and I came home and told her she should, and the kid. But by Wednesday, I thought, this is really true.
Yes.
I hadn't been at home for much. During the editing, I stayed until 10 o'clock.
Yeah. Yeah.
During the research, I'm on the phone until midnight. And when we're away, we're away. It's, 2 or 3 hours, maybe a day at most.
Yes.
I said to her, look, I said, I'm not going to give this up. Let me try and do a deal with you. Not a deal, I said, what I want to do is, can I involve you in my life? I will try and find projects where I can take one of you with me every time in the filming. You'll be able to watch it in the editing and take part in the research if you like.
Right.
And that way you'll be part of this life and out of it. My wife said, I think it's unlikely, but we'll try it. We'll try it. So the first film I made was about, I was looking now for something that where their filming would be all in one place. And so I could bring them to the hotel and they could stay. I made a film about medical research in Egypt in the Nile Delta, because I had been suggested we make a film about the effect that Islam beliefs have on science, which is supposed to be that an Islamic believing scientist shouldn't be competitive. They shouldn't try to make it their advantage, their knowledge. They shouldn't be a specialist. They should all be generalists, and they should publish and not keep it quiet. So I thought, all right, where is the most civilized place? And that's Egypt, and they're most advanced. So I got in touch with various people at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and said, because I use science as my absolute, I said, who's doing what there? And they said, well, there's a trial for praziquantel, a drug against schistosomiasis, being trialed in the Delta. And there's quite an interesting senior civil service scientist in charge of a team of 3 doctors doing that there. So I said, that sounds good. So I rang him up and said, yeah. And he said, Alameda. I said, tell me what you're doing. And he said, yes, we're in this village, that village, so on. These are the problems. So I went to Peter and said, I want to make this. And he said, okay. It sounds really detailed and good. So I said, Chum and my youngest daughter, we're going to Cairo, And I got there, and they were there, and the film crew came and said, "What's the wife doing here?" I said, "She's be helpful. She's the doctor. If you get it, you can help," and so on.
Yes.
And they came, and they watched, and we went to the pyramids when there was time off,
Yes.
and it worked. It worked quite well. So I started doing that. And when my next daughter up, the one who was 16, doing O-levels in chemistry, I took her on a trip where we were talking to chemists in San Francisco and Los Angeles about endorphins and about what it does in the brain. So Ruth could now say, I've been there, I've seen a protein analyzer, and it worked, it worked. So when I left, I could now do this just absolutely as much as I wanted, because the BBC were a bit reticent about it. They didn't like me blending the home in with this.
Yes,
Crews loved it actually after a bit.
Really
we went and filmed in China.
Yeah.
And I don't know, ever know Colin Munn, one of my favourite guys.
Yes.
He got on very well with my wife who came. I divided that one into 2. The first part, my daughter came, and she learned a great deal, and then Chum came, and she was a doctor, and Colin Munn and the assistant were always wanting to know, is this significant, is that significant? And we all got on very well together.
Yes. Did you like working with crews?
Yes,
Abroad?
loved it.
Yes.
Yes.
You didn't mind them always talking about how they were fiddling their expenses or the old Spanish practices?
No, I worked within the Spanish practices. Really, I mean, when I was filming in Israel with a crew at the Beersheba Medical School, they were amazed that I scheduled a 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock lunch break in, and told them where they can go to the restaurant, and that we would finish at 6 and so on. And I also said, we need to do something here, and I'm sorry, but you just have to claim overtime for that, and it's all right.
We ought to round this off. What was the program you were most proud of?
Well, I think there are probably 3. One was one that I made for the Open University called Work Study at Hoover Limited. The second one was, I think, the Chips. And the third one was China's Child. And all of them were kind of very, very different. But I kind of really enjoyed the end product when we got to it.
Yeah. So the Hoover program was about what, working practices and automation.
I was leading the technology television group in the Open University, and one of the academics said he wanted to make a program about work study and the way in which work was measured and led to negotiations about wages.
Oh,
And
the dreaded time and motion studies.
that's right.
Yeah.
It was all about time and motion studies. And the film actually was very good because the cooperation from the Union and Hoover was terrific, terrific. And it was really quite bitter, the way in which the guys on the production line making these Hoover upright machines negotiated, and and the way they were treated with dignity, but very harshly.
Yes.
And they were being measured to a tenth of a second when they moved this. It was all, and the detail of how you calculated how much, it was all just splendid. And when it was finished, I took it to show it to Hoover because that, being very BBC, we said we'll never have any editorial interference, but we promise, we'll do our best not to hurt you. And Hoover said, you can't do this. This is just showing us to be kind of awful. And I got a bit on my high horse, and James McCloy said to me, Ed, he said, look, we shouldn't try and accommodate this. He said, look, why don't we put a note on the end of the film saying we'd like to thank the Union and Hoover for staging these meetings in order to illustrate for the Open University what negotiation is about. He said, that won't detract at all from your movie. Everybody will see it's absolutely for real, and everybody will be happy. So I said, well, I'll agree to that. And we went to Hoover, and they said they'd agree to that. So that was the end of it. But it was very, it was my first real documentary, I think, first ever. And the cameraman was just determined to do his best. As you say, it was a very ring-fenced budget with a very limited kit for lighting and so on.
Yes.
But he just knew how to get into these situations and how to cope with a meeting where it was between him and him and on. He only had to look at me.
So you were filming real negotiations?
Oh, yes. Yeah, the whole thing was absolutely documentary and so on.
Well, that's a very interesting program. So the Chips Are Down we know about, and that was very successful. So the other one was about one-child policy, presumably in China, was it?
It tells you a lot about, I think, the way I do Horizons, but it's not a short story.
No,
all right. I'm very happy to tell it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd made a film about cancer research in China, which was just beautiful. It was about wonderful cooperation between me and the team there, and they loved me and all the rest of it. And the Chinese sort of loved it and so on. That was about 1978, I think. And then I wanted to do another one in China. I mean, this was before it was opened up. I was the first camera crew into China after Antonioni. And that was a serious mistake on his part, which is relevant to this. And so I was talking to various people about China, and they said, look, the one-child policy is, why don't you do it about that? It's really quite difficult. And I thought, okay, well, it'll be a general program about how they need it, the way they persuade people, this, that, and the other, and so on and so forth. And so I went to the Chinese embassy and said, look, I would like to make a program about your Chinese policy. As I understand it, you have the people who are on the ground managing the sewing machines and whatever, for whom they are not enthusiastic about it at all and want to resist. You have the people in Peking who see the disaster if it doesn't get limited, and the people in the middle are about the people who are, if you like, the mayor of a town, who knows he has to take these people this way and accommodate these people this way. I'd like to make a program about the role of the mayor in some of the towns. And they said, what a sophisticated person you are, Mr. Goldwyn. We think that is a very good idea. We will present it forward, and we will, let you know what the distinct comes back.
Yes.
So it came back, and they said, well, we think it is quite an interesting proposition. We would leave you to do it the way you want, but we will recommend you come to this town, which is called Changzhou, where we have several things going. So I said to myself, I'm sort of slightly suspicious. So I went to see the second secretary in the embassy, and I said, look, tell me about Changzhou. And he said, well, it's the place which is being used as an example to other places. Why don't you go and have a look? And if you don't like it, you of course could choose to go somewhere else. Where would you like to go? I'd say, well, I really fancy going to Sichuan, because I like Sichuan food. At which he laughed and said, what a wonderful reason. He said, I'll support you if you want to go to Sichuan, but you do realize that we never have the Peking government making offer before, so this is something you should take as being somewhat flattering to you, and if you turn it down, it will, I don't think it'll have any repercussions, but you know that. So I went away and I thought, well, if I've got freedom to go where I want, why should I not go to where they're going to be pleased that I went? So I went back and I said, I'll be pleased to go to Changzhou. And so they said, fine, and we made an arrangement. I'd go out for 2 weeks. I'd take my oldest daughter, she would come, and there would be a wonderful BBC employee who was a journalist who spoke Chinese and knew the country, had been there quite well. So we went out there as a team, and also with Sheila Heyman. Well, she was quite new in the BBC then, and Goodchild said, why don't you take her, because she speaks Chinese too, and you'll have, quite some backup. We don't want this to go wrong. All right. So we went out, and the place was really draconian. They were very, come and look at this. Here is a woman being aborted, because so-and-so. Here is all the people in this place who are the team who do the spinning in this factory. On the wall you see the menstruation chart of everybody. And if anybody goes wrong and starts not menstruating, then all these people will lose bonus, and so on. So after a week of this, I was quite upset, because this was going to be not a film that was going to be a sophisticated Mr. Goldwyn. How nice of you to be able to show how civilized the Chinese are in difficult circumstances. This was going to show how very determined they are, and human rights for nowhere. So I took Sheila and my daughter Ruth, and we went to another town, and we sat and we talked about it for a bit. And there's no way that we could go and get ready anywhere else for the crew that was coming. So it was either cancelling, and if it was cancelling, I know Goodchild didn't have the money to do this again. So, what we discovered was absolutely fascinating, but it wasn't the story that I thought it was. And Sheila and Ruth said, Ed, you could do this if you don't make it general. This is not about China. This is about these particular people in this circumstance. And you're not trying to say, this is the Chinese program, this is it. This is what's happening in Changzhou. So I thought, well, that's fair enough. So I knew somebody who'd been involved in the previous film, who was been one on Mao's Long March, a woman who'd been on the previous film to help. And she was called the Little Dragon. So I phoned the Little Dragon in Peking, and I said, look, this is my dilemma. I don't know what to do, but I think it's all right, and the thing that I'm going to do is go ahead with this. I don't want you to speak on behalf of it. I want you to advise me as Little Dragon to Edward and Beck. I'm ringing you because... And she said, I trust you. I think you will do what's honest, so you should go ahead. So we went back, and we went ahead, and we did it just like that. And the story became important because of something else that had happened in my life. I'm sorry to go on about it.
That's okay.
But this film in Egypt, I came back with lots of material and didn't know how to edit it, because really nothing fucking had happened, apart from people in boots going and dealing with the eggs of the snail and so on and so forth. And on television, I saw William Golding talking on the the Channel 4 program, whatever it was called, about arts, saying, oh, yes, but I'm a storyteller. That's what I do. I write books because I'm a storyteller. I thought that's what I need. So I rang him up the next day and said, William Goldwyn, can I come and talk to you? And he said, well, what about? I know absolutely nothing about television. And I said, yes, but, and he said, well, it happens I'm in London tomorrow. Come and have lunch with me at the Browns Hotel. So I went and I took Ruth, because Ruth, that's the eldest daughter, she was actually doing an A-level then about Golding's books. And I thought that might be useful to her. She still failed anyway. So I explained to Golding I had this stuff. And he said, look, Mr. Goldwyn, our lives are so different. He said, as I understand it, you've exposed 50 rolls of film and you're not quite sure what to do with it. I said, that's not a bad approximation. He said, look, I take sheets of white paper and I write on it what I want and I put it in order and I don't see how I can help you. So I thought, well, at least Ruth is here and at least Golding is there. So I said, I'm really interested to know about the way you write stories. How did you begin writing the story about the Neanderthals? It's a story from the point of view of a Neanderthal, yes. And he's in the mind of a Neanderthal man, yes, and it's in Neanderthal think, which is very creative.
Yes.
And he said, oh, it's very simple. He said, I began at the peripeteia. And I said, I don't know what a peripeteia is. He said, oh, you never went to a public school then. I said, tell me. He said, well, the peripeteia is where everything you've learnt in the book, story, has to be reassessed by something you learn, and it's a different story thereafter. I said, in the Inheritors, I said. He said, well, you've lived all the first 5 chapters in the mind of this guy who has difficulty in being able to have words to think about the future and discuss things. And then you're in a boat with 5 humans of the same, period, and they look back and they see this big red-haired man, and they say, that poor fucker, his daughter's here now, he's going to... And it's a shock, a big shock, because now you're in the mind of that you're familiar with. And he said, that's a peripeteia. You have to change everything you thought of, because it was being relayed to you by a man who doesn't think like you. So you have to take everything that was said knowing the way he thought. And I thought, that's what happened in Cairo. Because I misunderstood what Alamy was about. What Alamy was about was keeping his 3 doctors in Cairo so they would work for the Egyptian people. And what I had seen, it was really confusing and hurting me, was he never listened to them. He never discussed results with them. He was very autocratic. They weren't allowed to sit in his presence. They had to stand. One of them wanted to go and do something. He said, no, you will go and work in a clinic in this village because I think you need to meet the people. It was all like that, you see. So I said to him, I came hoping to see some Islamic science, but what I've seen is something which is not what I would call science really at all. You are bullying them. You are not encouraging their thinking. You are not doing this. They can't do this. They can't do that. And I had the courage to do this in an interview and so on. Yeah. And he leaned back with a big smile on his face. And he said, Mr. Goldwyn, he said, you don't have the eyes to see what is going on here. I said, tell me. He said, I am wanting to educate scientists who will do science in Egypt. I don't want them to go to Cambridge. I don't want them to go to Massachusetts. I don't want them to go to Adelaide. I want them to work here. So if they're here, they have to fit in with the culture of the Ministry of Health. Yes. They have to be part of wanting to help the people. That is why I treat them the way I do. You, thinking about science things, you have your way. He said, I have mine. You may not agree with it, but that's what I do. And when after this meeting with Golding, I thought, that's my peripeteia. That is it. So now I could redesign the program easily. For the China story. And the story too. Yes. I could say, you might not approve of this, but this is what's happening. This is what's happening. This is what's happening. And then the last 5 minutes was about, why are they doing this? They're doing this because this is the land, this is the food, this is the population, this is the growth. Could be wrong, but that's what they believe, at least that's what they're telling the people. And if you were faced with this problem, what's the alternative?
Yes.
I'll leave you to think about it.
Those are your favourite programmes, really.
Yeah. And I think it illustrates very well what I mean.
Yes.
It's not a what was that guy who came from London Weekend to work at the BBC as managing director?
Oh, God.
Anyway, his policy, which spread throughout the BBC, you don't let people go out with a finished script to shoot to. And he did that. And I think that was so impossible for me to do.
You don't mean John Burt.
I do mean John Burt.
Yes, you had to write it all before you went.
Yes.
Yes, you had to know exactly what you were going to get.
Yeah.
That's
Whereas
right.
this that I'm talking about, I was phoning back to Peter every few days, saying, look, we've come across this. What do you think?
But I expect the Burt method gives you a shooting ratio of 3 to 1, and your method gave you 20 to 1.
Well,
possibly.
not quite. Maybe 12, sometimes 10.
Yes. I think that's a very, very interesting story, Ed, and I think it's a great privilege to have talked to you, actually.
Oh, it's nice coming here and talking to you.
Really, seriously. And it's interesting how our paths, so we never actually met
Yes.
physically, you affected me greatly. And thank you for that.